It was a rainy night in July, and Julio, an experienced truck driver, adjusted his cap and looked at the dark sky. The heavy clouds promised a night of rain, but he had no choice. The cargo had to be delivered, and time was against him. He started the truck and left the depot, heading for the highway. As he drove through the streets, he thought about his family. His wife, Maria, and their 2 small children were at home, waiting for him. Julio worked hard to support his family, and each long trip meant more money in his pocket. But it also meant more time away from home, and he missed being with them. As soon as he hit the road, the rain began to fall. At first, it was in small drops, but it quickly turned into a torrential storm. The windshield wipers worked frantically, but could barely keep up with the intensity of the rain. Julio slowed down, staying alert for any danger on the road. The radio played a soft song, and Julio hummed along to distract himself from the oppressive weather. He always liked country music, and the melancholic lyrics matched his mood. As the road wound through the mountains, he felt increasingly isolated. The city lights were left behind, and darkness enveloped the truck like a shroud. That was when he saw her for the first time. A solitary figure on the side of the road, illuminated only by the truck's headlights. Julio blinked, believing his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the figure remained. He slowed down and stopped next to her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, lowering the window. The woman didn't respond. She was drenched by the rain, and her long black hair covered her face. She seemed lost, out of place. Julio felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at her for another moment, waiting for a response, but when nothing happened, he decided to move on. As he accelerated, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the woman still standing in the same place. His heart pounded, and he tried to dismiss the irrational fear that began to grip his mind. "She's just a lost woman," he thought. "Nothing to worry about." But a few miles down the road, he saw her again. This time, she was in the middle of the road. Julio braked sharply, and when he blinked, the woman had vanished. His heart raced as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. It must be fatigue, he thought. But the feeling that something was terribly wrong didn't leave him. The rain continued to fall, and the fog grew denser. Julio drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the road, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts occupying his mind. He felt as if he were being watched, but he could see nothing but darkness and rain. Suddenly, the radio began to hiss and turned off by itself. Julio tried to turn it on again, but nothing happened. He felt a chill run down his spine and gripped the steering wheel tighter. The darkness seemed denser, the road more deserted, and the feeling of being watched more intense. That was when he saw her again. The woman in the white dress stood in the middle of the road, her black eyes fixed on him. Julio braked sharply, and the truck skidded on the wet road. When it stopped, the woman had disappeared. Julio got out of the truck, panting and drenched by the rain. He looked around, but saw nothing but darkness. The silence was disturbing, and he felt an irrational fear take over his body. He knew he needed to continue, but the idea of returning to the truck terrified him. With courage, he got back in and started the engine. As he continued the journey, he prayed that it was just his imagination. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Minutes later, he felt an intense cold inside the truck cab. Looking in the rearview mirror, he saw the woman sitting in the back seat, her black eyes fixed on him. In panic, Julio veered the truck onto the shoulder and ran out, panting and drenched by the rain. Outside, he found himself alone again, with no sign of the woman. The road was deserted, and the silence was disturbing. Julio knew he needed to continue, but the idea of returning to the truck terrified him. With courage, he got back in and started the engine. As he continued the journey, he prayed that it was just his imagination. However, when he reached his destination, he heard faint whispers coming from the radio, now back on. The next morning, Julio was exhausted and disturbed. He barely managed to sleep, tormented by the images of the woman in the white dress. He decided to ask the locals about what had happened on the road. He found an old man in a local cafe who seemed to know the region well. Julio explained what he had seen, and the man looked at him with sad eyes. "You saw Helena," said the man. "She disappeared on that road many years ago. They say she was returning home when she had an accident. Her body was never found." Julio felt a chill run down his spine as the man continued. Since then, many drivers have reported seeing her figure along BR 495, especially on rainy and foggy nights. She seems to be trapped between this world and the next, looking for something or someone. Julio swallowed hard. The man's words confirmed his worst fears. He had seen a ghost, and the experience had left him deeply shaken. He thanked the man and left the cafe, feeling even more disturbed. Despite his fear, Julio knew he needed to keep working. He couldn't leave his family unprotected. A few days later, he was hired for another trip that would take him back to the road. He tried to refuse, but the need for money spoke louder. As he drove down the road again, he felt a growing tension. The night was clear, with no rain, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. He drove slowly, his eyes alert for any sign of danger. As he approached the place where he had first seen the woman, he felt a chill. He looked around, but saw nothing but the deserted road. However, he couldn't deny the feeling that something was wrong. That was when he heard a faint whisper coming from the radio. His heart pounded as he tried to ignore the sound. But the whisper grew louder, and he realized it wasn't just a random noise. It was a voice, and it was calling him. "Julio." The voice whispered. "Julio." He tried to turn off the radio, but the button didn't respond. Panic took over his body as he heard the voice call his name repeatedly. He knew he needed to get out of there, but the road seemed endless. Finally, he saw a gas station on the side of the road and stopped the truck. He ran out of the cab, panting and sweating. The station attendant looked at him curiously, but Julio was too shaken to explain what had happened. He entered the convenience store and bought a coffee, trying to calm down. He sat at a table and took a deep breath, trying to process what had occurred. The voice on the radio, the feeling of being watched, it all seemed surreal. Determined to find answers, Julio decided to investigate more about Helena's story. He returned to the local cafe and looked for the old man who had spoken to him earlier. The man seemed surprised to see him back. "You came back," he said, with a tone of concern. "I thought you had left." Julio explained what had happened on the road, and the man shook his head. Helena was a beautiful young woman, loved by everyone. Her death was a tragedy for the community. Some say she was a victim of a crime, others believe it was an accident. But no one knows for sure. Julio asked if there was anywhere he could find more information about Helena. The man suggested visiting the local library, where he could find old newspapers and files that might help clarify the mystery. At the library, Julio spent hours going through old newspapers and documents. He found several stories about Helena's disappearance and the sightings reported by drivers over the years. Each account was eerily similar to his own encounter. While flipping through the newspapers, Julio found an article that caught his attention. It was an interview with Helena's family, describing the events leading up to her disappearance. According to the article, Helena was returning home after visiting friends when her car skidded on the wet road and fell into a ravine. The article also mentioned that there were signs of a struggle in the car, suggesting that Helena might have been attacked before the accident. The police investigated the case but never found conclusive evidence about what really happened that night. Julio felt a chill as he read the words. He knew there was more to Helena's story than the newspapers revealed. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to visit the ravine where Helena's car had been found. When he arrived at the location, he felt a sense of heaviness, as if the air were laden with Helena's sadness and despair. He looked at the ravine, trying to imagine what had happened that fateful night. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper, like the wind blowing through the trees. He turned and saw Helena's figure standing at the edge of the ravine, looking at him with eyes full of sadness. "Help me," she whispered. Julio felt a shiver down his spine. He knew he needed to do something to help Helena find peace. He decided to gather more information and talk to people who knew Helena. Julio returned to the village and began to talk to the locals. Little by little, he discovered more details about Helena's life and her tragic death. He found out she had a boyfriend, Roberto, who was the prime suspect in the investigation but was never charged due to lack of evidence. Julio decided to confront Roberto and ask him what really happened that night. He found Roberto living in an old house on the outskirts of the village, and when he approached, he saw a man consumed by guilt and regret. Roberto was surprised by Julio's visit, but agreed to talk. He admitted that he and Helena had argued the night of her death, and she had left in anger. Roberto followed her, trying to make amends, but when he arrived at the scene of the accident, it was too late. He claimed he had nothing to do with Helena's death and had been haunted by her spirit ever since. Julio listened to Roberto's story and felt a deep sadness. He realized that Helena's spirit was trapped, unable to move on due to the unresolved circumstances of her death. He decided to help Roberto confront his guilt and seek forgiveness. Together, Julio and Roberto visited the ravine where Helena's car had been found. They stood in silence, praying for her soul. Roberto tearfully asked for Helena's forgiveness, admitting his mistakes and expressing his deep regret. As they prayed, Julio felt a sense of peace come over him. He looked up and saw Helena's figure, now with a serene expression. She nodded, as if to say goodbye, and then disappeared into the mist. Julio felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew that Helena had finally found peace and could move on. He and Roberto returned to the village, knowing that they had done the right thing. From that day on, Julio never saw Helena's ghost again. He continued to work as a truck driver, but the road felt less lonely. He knew that he had helped a lost soul find peace, and that knowledge gave him a sense of fulfillment and purpose. The legend of Helena continued to be told by the locals, but now with an ending of redemption and forgiveness. And Julio, whenever he drove down BR 495, would look at the dark road with a sense of respect and reverence, knowing that he had played a part in freeing a tormented spirit. In the heart of London, there was an old orphanage known as St. Mary's Orphanage. Closed over 30 years ago after a series of inexplicable tragedies, the place lay abandoned and shrouded in dark legends. Recently, a charitable organization decided to reopen the orphanage to shelter needy children, hoping to erase its shadowy past and bring new light to the place. The restoration team, led by Laura and her husband Raphael, arrived at the site in early June. They brought along their 2 children, Julia and Felipe, to assist them during the summer. From the moment they crossed the rusty gates, they felt a heavy and oppressive atmosphere. Overgrown vegetation and broken windows gave the place an air of abandonment and mystery. The first days were spent cleaning and organizing. The team uncovered old toys, dusty furniture, and photographs of children who had lived there decades ago. Among the items, Laura found a porcelain doll with a disturbing gaze. Feeling a chill, she decided to store it away in a box in the basement. During the first week of work, strange events began to occur. Laura heard children's laughter echoing through the halls, but upon investigation, found no one there. Julia discovered an old diary belonging to a girl named Isabella, written in the 1950s, detailing life in the orphanage and mentioning a man in a hat who appeared at night. Felipe started having vivid nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. One night, while Raphael worked late restoring the main hall, he saw a slender figure cross the hallway. Thinking it was one of the children, he followed, but when he turned the corner, the hallway was empty. A cold sensation ran down his spine, and he decided not to mention the incident to avoid worrying his family. Fascinated by Isabella's diary, Julia began reading it every night. Isabella described frightening and inexplicable events, such as doors closing on their own, whispers in the darkness, and children disappearing without a trace. The man in a hat was a constant presence in her accounts, a shadowy figure watching over the children as they slept. Laura, too, began to sense a strange presence. One night, while cleaning the basement, she discovered a secret room filled with old toys and small beds, like a hidden dormitory. The walls were covered in children's drawings, all depicting the figure of the man in the hat, always with a sinister smile. As she studied the drawings, Laura noticed they told a story. The early ones showed children playing, but gradually, the man in the hat appeared, watching from afar. In later drawings, he drew closer and closer to the children, until the last ones depicted only the man in the hat, surrounded by shadows and indistinct figures. Felipe was the first to have a direct encounter with the supernatural. One night, while exploring the orphanage with a flashlight, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly and saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching him. He froze in fear, unable to move. The figure slowly began to approach, and when it was just a few meters away from Felipe, it vanished into thin air, leaving only a smell of sulfur. Felipe ran to tell his parents, but they didn't take him seriously, thinking it was just a nightmare caused by the eerie atmosphere of the orphanage. However, Laura began to notice changes in Felipe. He was always tired, had deep circles under his eyes, and avoided certain places in the orphanage. Felipe began to draw compulsively. His drawings depicted macabre scenes, children disappearing into shadows, distorted figures, and always, on every page, the man in the hat, with his menacing smile. Desperate for answers, Laura decided to delve deeper into the orphanage's history. She discovered that before becoming an orphanage, the building was a mansion owned by a wealthy family. After the tragic death of their youngest daughter, the family abandoned the house, which was later converted into an orphanage. During its years of operation, several children disappeared without explanation, and there were rumors of dark rituals performed by the former owners. Laura found an old newspaper article mentioning a fire that destroyed part of the orphanage and resulted in the deaths of several children and one caretaker, a man often seen wearing a hat. She went to the local library, where she found old archives and more accounts of the orphanage. She learned that the caretaker, Samuel Costa, was known for his occult practices and was accused of abuse, but never convicted due to lack of evidence. As the paranormal activities intensified, Laura decided to seek help from a local priest, Father Antonio, known for dealing with supernatural phenomena. Father Antonio agreed to help and came to the orphanage to perform a blessing. During the ceremony, horrific things began to happen. Doors slammed violently, windows shattered, and a sinister laughter echoed through the corridors. The priest attempted to exorcise the evil spirit, but was thrown against the wall by an invisible force, gravely injured. Blood streamed from cuts on his face, and he muttered prayers as he tried to get up. Laura, Raphael, Julia, and Felipe gathered in one of the rooms, terrified. They knew they needed to get out, but the malevolent presence seemed to block all exits. It was then that Felipe, in a trance-like state, began to speak with a voice that was not his own, revealing himself to be the spirit of one of the missing children. He explained that the man in the hat was the vengeful spirit of the former caretaker, who had made a pact with dark forces to gain immortality. With the help of the child's spirit, the family managed to find a secret way out through the basement. As they fled, the malevolent presence pursued them, trying to prevent their escape. Doors slammed shut violently, shadows moved swiftly across the walls, and screams echoed through the hallway. Upon reaching the outside, the orphanage began to tremble as if collapsing upon itself. The family ran to their car and sped away, leaving behind the nightmare that had nearly destroyed them. As they drove away, they looked back and saw the orphanage engulfed in supernatural flames that burned without consuming the structure. They heard one last cry of agony before speeding off into the dark road. Months later, Laura and Raphael tried to move on with their lives, but the memories of what they experienced at St. Mary's Orphanage never left them. Felipe continued to have nightmares, and Julia felt a dark presence watching her from afar. The orphanage was sealed once again, but the legends of the man in the hat and the missing children continued to haunt the local community. Determined to fully understand what happened, Laura began writing a book about her experiences. During her research, she discovered that the malevolent presence was linked to an ancient cult that used the orphanage as a front for their rituals. The man in the hat was the leader of this cult, which sacrificed children to gain power and immortality. Meanwhile, Raphael dedicated himself to helping other families affected by supernatural phenomena, forming a support group to share experiences and find solutions. He began studying exorcisms and spiritual protection practices, determined never to be caught off guard again. The story of St. Mary's Orphanage remains a dark warning about the horrors that can reside in the most unexpected places, waiting to be awakened by those who dare challenge their silence. And so, the legacy of the man in the hat endures, a sinister shadow that will never be forgotten.